When 24-year-old Maria Santos stepped up to the Family Feud podium and said 9 words that would expose a hidden epidemic, nobody in the studio knew they were about to witness the most heartbreaking sacrifice ever shared on television. But it wasn't just what she said that stopped Steve Harvey cold. It was the way she said it, with the exhausted resignation of someone who had given up her 20s to care for someone who could no longer remember her name. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was the moment when America met its youngest old soul, carrying burdens that most people couldn't imagine. Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta began with the typical energy of a game show taping. The Santos family from San Antonio faced off against the Chen family from Seattle. But there was something different about Maria Santos that caught the production crew's attention immediately. At 24, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older, her eyes holding a weariness that seemed impossible for her age. Maria Santos stood at the family podium wearing a simple blue blouse and black slacks, clothes that spoke of practicality over fashion, of someone who had learned to prioritize function over form. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, revealing a face that was beautiful despite the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Next to her stood her father, Carlos Santos, 58, whose weathered hands spoke of construction work and whose protective stance near Maria suggested he understood the weight his daughter carried. Completing the Santos family were Maria's Aunt Rosa, 45, who had flown in from Phoenix to help with the family, and Maria's younger brother Diego, 19, a college sophomore whose presence on the show represented a luxury Maria had never been able to afford for herself. What the studio audience couldn't see, couldn't know from Maria's composed exterior, was the life that had brought her to this moment. For the past 10 years, since she was 14 years old, Maria had been the primary caregiver for her mother, Carmen Santos, who had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease at the impossibly young age of 42. The diagnosis had shattered the Santos family's world. Carmen had been a vibrant woman, a teacher at the local elementary school, the heart of their household, who had filled their home with laughter and music. Watching her slowly disappear, watching her forget first small things, then important things, then eventually the faces of the people who loved her most, had been like witnessing a slow-motion tragedy with no possibility of a happy ending. While other teenagers had been going to prom and graduation parties, Maria had been learning to manage medication schedules and behavioral changes. While her classmates had gone off to college, Maria had stayed home to provide round-the-clock care for a mother who increasingly didn't recognize her as her daughter. The progression had been devastating to watch. Carmen's decline had accelerated through Maria's late teens, requiring constant supervision, help with basic tasks, and emotional support for someone who lived in a constant state of confusion and fear. Maria had become expert at managing wandering episodes, aggressive outbursts, and the heartbreaking moments when Carmen would look at her own daughter and ask, "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" Carlos had worked double shifts to pay for Carmen's care and medications, leaving Maria to handle the day-to-day responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most adults, let alone a teenager. Maria had learned to hide her exhaustion, her resentment, her grief for the mother she'd lost while that same mother was still physically present. The isolation had been perhaps the most difficult part. Friends had initially tried to include Maria in their activities, but the unpredictability of her mother's condition made planning impossible. Eventually, the invitations had stopped coming. Maria had watched her peer group move through college, relationships, career beginnings, while she remained frozen in a caregiving role that seemed to have no end. At 24, Maria had never been on a real date. She'd never lived away from home, never traveled, never experienced the freedom that most people took for granted in their 20s. Her life was measured in medication times, doctor appointments, and the brief moments of peace when Carmen slept. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Rosa, Maria's aunt, who had submitted their application with a desperate note. "My niece has given up her entire youth to care for her mother. She deserves one day of joy, one moment where she's not responsible for anyone else's well-being." The producers had been moved by the family's story during the interview process, particularly by Maria's quiet strength and the obvious love that held the family together despite impossible circumstances. The trip to Atlanta had been Maria's first time away from her mother in over 2 years. Carmen was staying at a specialized care facility for the weekend, an arrangement that had cost the family significant money but had given Maria a brief taste of what normal felt like. During family introductions, Steve had approached them with his characteristic warmth, though something about Maria's demeanor immediately caught his attention. There was a gravity to her that seemed unusual for someone her age. The Santos family from San Antonio. Y'all ready to have some fun today? Carlos stepped forward as the family spokesperson, his voice carrying the strength that comes from years of holding a family together through crisis. We're ready, Steve. This is my daughter Maria, my son Diego, and my sister Rosa. Steve approached Maria with his usual warmth, but something in her presence suggested depths that went beyond typical young adult experience. Maria, you excited to be here? Maria nodded, offering a smile that was genuine, but seemed to require effort. Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey. This is really special for our family. Something in the way she said special, with an emphasis that suggested such moments were rare in her life, caught Steve's attention. He looked at her more closely, noting the maturity in her eyes that seemed inconsistent with her age. The game progressed normally through the first 4 rounds. The Santos family was playing well, with Diego and Rosa providing energy while Carlos gave solid, thoughtful answers. Maria had buzzed in once, giving a response that showed both intelligence and the kind of practical thinking that comes from real-world responsibility. During commercial breaks, production assistants noticed the family's protective dynamic around Maria. Rosa would check on her frequently, asking if she needed anything. Carlos would squeeze her shoulder encouragingly. Diego, despite being younger, treated his sister with a respect that suggested he understood the sacrifices she'd made for their family. But it was during the 5th round that everything changed. The category that appeared on the board seemed simple enough. Name something you do every day. Maria had been selected to answer, her first time approaching the podium alone throughout the entire game. She walked forward with the careful composure she'd developed over years of managing crisis situations, but something in her expression suggested this question carried more weight than it appeared to. Steve read the question with his usual enthusiasm, unaware that he was about to witness something that would transform the entire studio. Maria, here we go, name something you do every day. Maria looked directly at Steve, then at the camera that would broadcast this moment to millions. When she spoke, her voice was clear but carried an exhaustion that seemed to age her years in seconds. Take care of someone who doesn't remember me. The studio fell completely silent. Not the brief pause of audience consideration, but the profound quiet that comes when people suddenly understand they are witnessing something much deeper than entertainment. Steve's mouth fell slightly open. In decades of hosting, he had heard thousands of answers, but something in Maria's tone and the weight of those 9 words told him this was more than a game show response. Take care of someone who doesn't remember you, Steve repeated slowly, as if testing the meaning of the words. Maria nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. My mother has Alzheimer's, Mr. Harvey. She was diagnosed when I was 14. For 10 years I've been her primary caregiver. Every day I help someone who doesn't know I'm her daughter. The revelation hit the studio like a physical force. The audience, which moments before had been engaged in typical game show energy, now sat in stunned silence as they processed what they were hearing. Behind them, Carlos brought his hands to his face, not because he was surprised by Maria's words, but because he hadn't expected his daughter to share their family's deepest pain on national television. Rosa reached for Diego's hand, both of them understanding that years of suppressed emotion were finally finding their voice. Steve Harvey, who had spent his career managing timing and maintaining energy, found himself completely off script. This wasn't just a contestant sharing a difficult story. This was a young woman revealing the cost of a sacrifice that most people couldn't comprehend. Maria, Steve said gently, walking closer to where she stood at the podium. Tell me about your mother. What happened next would transform the show entirely. Maria straightened slightly, drawing on the strength that had carried her through a decade of impossible circumstances. Her name is Carmen. She was a teacher, full of life, always laughing. The diagnosis came when she was 42, early-onset Alzheimer's. Her voice grew steadier as she continued, years of keeping quiet finally breaking. I was supposed to go to college, have a normal life, but someone had to take care of her and we couldn't afford professional care, so I stayed home. The studio was completely silent now. Even the production crew had stopped their usual bustling activity, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Every morning I wake up and help her get dressed, because she's forgotten how buttons work, Maria continued, her voice beginning to crack with emotion she'd held back for years. I feed her, because she doesn't remember what food is for. I read to her, even though she doesn't understand the words anymore. Behind the cameras, seasoned crew members were wiping their eyes. This wasn't just good television. This was a revelation of love, of sacrifice, of the way human beings can find strength in impossible circumstances. Steve looked at Carlos, whose face showed the particular kind of heartbreak that comes from watching your child sacrifice their youth for circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Maria," Steve said softly, "how long has it been since your mother recognized you?" 3 years, Maria replied without hesitation. 3 years since she last called me by name. Now I'm just the nice lady who helps her. Sometimes she's afraid of me. Sometimes she thinks I'm trying to hurt her." The profound honesty of that statement, delivered by someone who had spent her entire adult life caring for someone who could no longer appreciate that care, left everyone in the studio speechless. "But I keep doing it," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger, "because somewhere in there, she's still my mom, and even if she can't remember loving me, I remember loving her. That has to be enough." Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of shows and met countless families, found himself facing something he had never encountered. This wasn't just a caregiver sharing their story. This was a young woman demonstrating what unconditional love looks like when it's tested by the cruelest circumstances imaginable. "Stop the clocks," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio with unprecedented authority. "Stop everything." The game show timers froze, the music cut out, the audience held its collective breath. Steve walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself so he could address the entire studio while staying close to Maria. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, his voice carrying a gravity that transformed the atmosphere, "we just heard something extraordinary. We just heard what sacrifice sounds like when it's measured not in days or months, but in years of your life." He gestured toward Maria. "This young woman right here has given up her 20s, her freedom, her chance at a normal life, to care for someone who can't even remember her name. That's not just love, that's heroism in its purest form." The audience began to respond, but Steve wasn't finished. "Maria Santos," Steve said, turning to face her directly, "I need you to know something that nobody has probably told you in 10 years. What you're doing is not just admirable, it's extraordinary. You are 24 years old, and you have shown more love, more commitment, more selflessness than most people show in an entire lifetime." Maria was crying now, tears she'd been holding back for years finally finding their release. Steve walked closer to Maria, his voice growing more passionate. "And I need everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home to understand something. There are thousands of young people like Maria, giving up their youth to care for parents with dementia, with Alzheimer's, with conditions that steal the people we love while leaving their bodies behind." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "Maria," he said, "this has my personal phone number on it. Because what you just shared with us, that's not just television, that's ministry. That's teaching all of us what real love looks like when it costs everything." But Steve wasn't done. He began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments of profound connection. "This jacket," Steve said, draping it around Maria's shoulders, "has been with me through thousands of shows, but today it goes home with someone who understands what it really means to serve others." The jacket seemed to transform Maria, giving her an appearance of the recognition she'd never received for her sacrifice. Steve turned to address the entire studio again. "You know what we're going to do? We're going to finish this game, and the Santos family is going to win. But more than that, we're going to make sure Maria gets something she hasn't had in 10 years, a real vacation, time away, a chance to remember what it feels like to be 24. As the show concluded, Steve made an unprecedented announcement. His foundation would provide funding for professional care for Carmen, giving Maria her first real break in a decade. The response from the audience was immediate and overwhelming. But the most powerful moment came when Steve knelt down slightly to meet Maria at eye level. "Maria," he said, "I want you to look right into that camera and tell every young caregiver watching that they're not alone, that their sacrifice matters, that someone sees them." Maria looked directly into the main camera, her voice steady despite her tears, speaking with the authority of someone who had lived through circumstances most people couldn't imagine. "To every young person taking care of a parent," she said, "I want you to know that what you're doing matters, even when it feels invisible, even when it feels thankless, even when the person you're caring for doesn't remember your name. Love doesn't need memory to be real." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Behind the cameras, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Crew members who had worked on hundreds of episodes found themselves profoundly moved by this young woman's wisdom and strength. As the show concluded, something remarkable happened. Young people in the studio audience began approaching Maria, not for autographs or photos, but to share their own stories of caring for parents with dementia, of sacrificing their youth for family obligations. Maria's courage in speaking her truth had created a safe space for others to acknowledge their own hidden sacrifices. One woman, probably in her early 30s, approached Maria with tears streaming down her face. "I've been caring for my father with Parkinson's for 5 years," she said quietly. "I thought I was the only one. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone." A young man, maybe 26, shook Maria's hand with fierce respect. "My mom has multiple sclerosis," he said. "I've given up a lot too. Seeing you up there, hearing you speak, it helps me remember why it's worth it." The episode that aired 8 weeks later became one of the most impactful in Family Feud history, not because of dramatic moments or unexpected twists, but because of the profound lesson in love and sacrifice delivered by a young woman who had learned to measure life not in personal achievements, but in service to others. The response was overwhelming. The show received over 350,000 messages from viewers, many from young caregivers, sharing their own stories of sacrifice and isolation. Alzheimer's organizations reported increased awareness and support. Caregiver support groups saw significant increases in participation. But perhaps the most powerful response came from other young adults who suddenly understood that their complaints about normal 20-something problems paled in comparison to what some of their peers were facing in silence. Steve Harvey said in interviews that Maria's episode changed how he understood both sacrifice and strength. "I met a young woman that day who had given up everything most people her age take for granted," he explained. "But she never presented herself as a victim. She presented herself as someone who had found meaning in service." The jacket Steve gave Maria hangs in her room now, next to photos of better days with her mother and certificates from caregiver support groups where she now speaks regularly. But the real change wasn't in what Maria received that day, it was in what she gave to everyone watching. Maria Santos is still caring for her mother, but no longer alone. The funding from Steve's foundation has provided professional help, giving Maria her first real breaks in years. She's enrolled in online college courses, finally pursuing the education she'd deferred for a decade. The business card Steve gave her sits framed on her nightstand, not because she's needed to use it, but because it represents something powerful. The moment when her private sacrifice became a public inspiration, when her hidden heroism was finally acknowledged. Every Mother's Day, Maria posts a photo on social media of herself with Carmen, along with a simple message: "Love doesn't need memory to be real." Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers who are still here, even when they're not fully here. The lesson Maria Santos taught that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta is profound. The greatest love often requires the greatest sacrifice, and the most important work often goes unseen and unrecognized. And sometimes it takes a 24-year-old caregiver and an oversized suit jacket to remind a television studio full of adults that heroism isn't always dramatic or public. Sometimes it's quiet, daily, and measured in the accumulation of small acts of love that nobody else will ever fully understand. Because that's what real strength looks like. That's what unconditional love sounds like. And that's what happens when a game show becomes a platform for recognizing the invisible heroes among us, the young people who give up their youth so others can live with dignity, even when those others can no longer remember their names.